Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. You can find links to all of the stories that we're talking about on today's program by visiting breakpoint.org. Well, John, I don't think I've thought about GameStop for any extended period of time since high school. And
Did you go to GameStop as a high schooler? Was that
I
like a
did from
big
time to
deal?
time. I mean,
Okay.
I wasn't that into video games. I played a few of them. My brother had an Xbox, so I'd get in games for his birthday and stuff. But I mean, I haven't been to GameStop and heaven knows how long, and not many other people have either because it was a tanking company until this past month, and then something crazy happened with it. And normally, we're not like a finance show. We don't normally talk about Wall Street stocks, things like that here, but. There are some interesting implications out of this story where GameStop's stocks not only rallied but shot through the ceiling and became some of the more valuable stocks on the market. And it was due to this kind of populist uprising using an investing app called Robinhood. And this thing was incited in an investing thread on Reddit, which is, for those who don't know, it's kind of the back alley of the internet where people get together and just discuss various things like this. And it has, kind of alt-right overtones and things. But the bottom line is a bunch of hedge funds on Wall Street, multi-billion-dollar hedge funds, bit the dust hard in the last couple of weeks because of the investment, the sort of groundswell of investment that happened in GameStop. Because these hedge fund managers had bet against this company. That's how they make their money. So let's talk about the implications of this so-called populist revolt on Wall Street and what it reveals about our culture. We had a little bit of a discussion about this on the Q&A podcast, John. We've talked about it at the editorial meeting and so forth. But there's a lot to think about here. It's kind of symbolic of a broader dissatisfaction and a struggle between people who feel disenfranchised, on the grassroots level, and those who kind of rule the roost and who play by a different set of rules.
Well, look, I'm fascinated by this story. And for the record, I've never physically been in a single GameStop store ever in my entire life. Never once. Unless I'm just forgetting something. Never was a gamer. It really wasn't a big thing. I think my mom once found a Pong set at a yard sale that she brought home, and that was it. Never had anything really beyond that. But this story, to me, is extremely fascinating because there's so much, about it that's interesting. Um, you know, there's certainly the immediate realities, right? Which is the realities of something that's become very common in the market, and that is betting against companies that seem to be fragile, like GameStop. And many hedge funds were betting against it, and really for good reason. There wasn't a whole lot to GameStop as a company that justified kind of the stock price. It had been kind of driven up in the short term by the founder of a very successful pet business called Chewy. He had jumped in, as a millennial. I think he's a millennial, and he jumped into this, and so that was really interesting. But it really was when the Reddit users learned that Wall Street was shorting it, they just kind of got mad. And for the first time, their powers united. And I
Yeah.
say that kind of as a joke, but in a real sense, the desire to control the market, the desire to manipulate the market, that's nothing new. And that's certainly not, something that just belongs to Reddit users. That's something that, people who have, a lot invested in a particular company and have the access to be interviewed on CNBC or whatever stock option. I mean, you just have this all the time. But the power to actually unite and mobilize 4 million people all at the same time, this is new. And I was just speaking just recently to a guy who had spent a lot of his life and career in this industry. And he said, Wall Street kind of knew that this was a possibility, but it's one thing to kind of know it's a possibility and to think, oh, it could ever happen. It's kind of like an EMP. Is that really going to happen? Theoretically, it's a possibility, and certain companies are going to take, stands against it or steps against it. So there's that part of it, but the longer term thing is just what we saw from these investors, and that was not just kind of the desire to get rich, which is oftentimes what you hear when people are critiquing any sort of market scheme. It's usually designed to get rich. Now, a lot of people did get rich
Yeah. But this
just
wasn't
in the
about
last few
that.
days.
And you can tell by the behaviors of some of these investors who are staying in when they should be selling.
Oh, it wasn't. It wasn't about that at all. I mean, you had people posting pictures on Reddit of paying off bills and off a big profit, which was really, bragging on the money they made. And then you have people posting pictures of buying in at 400 and some dollars, which for GameStop was insane. And then saying, look at what I just did. And that's more of a stick it, to Wall Street, stick it to the investors. There was as much pleasure here, and not just am I going to make a lot of money, but am I going to make these guys go under.
Mm.
But look, what I keep seeing though is undertones of a collision that has been taking place in our culture for decades, and that is this collision between modernism and postmodernism. People are going to hear this. It is very popular for apologetics and worldview naysayers to hear any talk about postmodernism and go, "Oh, that was so 1990s." And the idea was, well, if truth is relative, then stop signs are relative, or and so we would teach about relativism to our students and use examples like, well, obviously not all truth is relative, and we'd have the examples, and the naysayers would actually critique us and go, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Do you realize what's happened in our culture? Like the craziest examples we used to use to show where postmodern ideas would go have actually become true. Like, in other words, well, does reality change if I say it? We literally have an entire movement that says reality is irrelevant to whatever I want it and choose it to be.
Mm.
Now, we might not have people that say stop signs are relative, but we clearly have people that say the rules of Wall Street are relative, right? And we have for a long time. The point is that the generational conflict between kind of the builder generation, and what we have now, which is a real sense that things are broken, a real frustration that the people who set the rules don't play by the rules. And we see this in politics, and we see this in economics, and we see this in church, and we see this in, even education and theology. Um, what we saw, I think, with the GameStop drive and the whole impulse behind it is what we saw with the unrest of 2020, what we saw with the political radicalization on the edges of the left and the right. It's just a real unstable time, culturally speaking. And so what's driving the action is fear, it's anger, it's a sense of wanting to get back at someone who has, theoretically or hypothetically, wronged us. And this is, but I guess the reason I want to talk about it, Shane, is this is yet another corner of culture where we're seeing this.
Mm.
In other words, this isn't the first time we've seen it. It's maybe the first time we saw it having to do with a stock option like this, but it's not different than what we're seeing in so many other arenas of culture. And that should tell us a lot. This is a big old mirror, I think, just like, the stories surrounding the election, what happened at the
Mhm.
Capitol, the instability in cities, the pushback on regulations having to do with, masks or lockdowns or everything. There's just not a lot stabilizing our culture right now. And it's like one arena after another is becoming more and more vulnerable. We say this, right? Like cultures have rules, and if you break those rules, cultures get unstable. And cultures usually don't get murdered; they commit suicide, right? They don't die with a bang; they burn out with a whimper. And gosh, are we seeing this? Is that really what we're seeing?
I've seen, the phrase used often that those who participated in driving up this stock and, driving these hedge funds into the ground, were doing it for the lulls, which is online speak for doing it for the laughs. And the idea there harkens back to this notion of generational conflict between the population and the elites. There's an intersection going on here that I've seen tied very closely with, like you said, what happened at the Capitol, the populist movement that Donald Trump rode into office, the sense of disenfranchisement that a large group of Americans, not necessarily the same group in all these cases, but groups of Americans feel that they have been cheated, that they have been disenfranchised, that they don't have power, they don't have influence, they don't control their society, and yet they still have to pay the price for the decisions of elites who do control society. And so I've read article after article trying to parse this out in terms of a generational conflict. Is this the millennials and the Gen Z getting back at the boomers for ruining their early adult lives with the 2008 financial crisis, and then how they had to pay the price with their real estate and their bank accounts and their college loans, but the billionaires on Wall Street didn't have to pay, they got bailed out? Or is this a conflict between political groups, or is this a conflict between the different aspects of the financial industry? All these different efforts to sort of map it onto other conflicts have a grain of truth in them, but they're not necessarily the whole story. What's new about this, John, as far as I can tell, looking back on on my short memory, is the people en masse doing something financially not to make money, but to make sure other people lose money, doing something out of spite, something to destroy others' financial interest, and potentially damaging the whole financial system in the process. That is an interesting motive, and it's something that I'm not sure the existing system has the capacity to process. When we talked about this earlier this week, the image immediately came to mind of that scene from The Dark Knight where the Joker has that giant pile of cash they've stolen, and the gangsters are all like, haha, this is sweet, what are you going to do with your portion? And he lights the whole thing on fire, and he goes, it's not about the money, it's about sending a message. And that's the way that those who participated in this whole short squeeze seem to have really had in mind.
Yeah, that's right. And not all of them, right? I mean, some of them just really wanted to
Well,
make money.
yeah, and I've read
Some of
something.
them,
Yeah, I've read something to the effect that, hey, don't think this is too populist. There's actually signs that there are some smart Wall Street types involved in this
oh,
behind the scenes.
absolutely. Are you kidding? Yeah. I mean, listen, if there is a way to mobilize for profit, it's going to happen. And there were definitely people who rode that profit train and were great. I heard about one kind of really cool story of a mom who, just because her son was 8 years old and she wanted to teach him about the stock market, on his birthday last year, bought him 3 shares of GameStop stock. And then suddenly woke up and was like, holy cow, it jumped. And he sold it,
Total
made 30,
accident.
he made $3,600, man. That's a lot of video games for this 9-year-old. I mean, there's those stories too. Um, but there were people that, the point was, the system's broken and I'm angry. And there's so much of that when a community breaks down that takes place. There's also a point to this where, you know, and I was just having this conversation. I thought it was really interesting. Those motivational posters, Shane, where it has kind of like a landscape with there's no I
Yeah.
in team or something.
And then it's like Trajan font at the bottom.
Right, right. There's also demotivational posters,
I
which
love
are
those.
just completely sarcastic and they're a lot of fun.
Always remember, you're totally unique, just like
Just
everyone
like
else.
everyone else. Yeah. Well, one of them is skydivers holding hands, and the caption is stupidity. Never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups, right? Which is, you will do things in groups that you will never do by yourself. I mean, the Capitol is a classic example of that. You have people, that were looking to hunt down lawmakers in an act of insurrection. And you had others that were staying between the velvet ropes, taking selfies, going, ooh, this is cool. I've never been in this building before.
Right.
And they all went through the same broken window. I mean, there's just, that's what crowds will do. And there was a bunch of crowd stuff that also is reflected in this. But I'm tempted to use that phrase, the madness of crowds, from you, since you quoted Douglas Murray so much lately. but it really is. I mean, there is something that happens when you're in a group that you don't always think it all the way through. And so there's a part of that to this story too. But even that points to the fact of people who are morally formed and are less likely to just go on a whim. And there's so much about this that was really a whim for so many people. And for as many people as made a lot of money, there certainly is a lot of people that lost a lot of money. But it's just the anger and the fear, which, for the record, is never a good way to do almost anything in your life, right?
Mm.
And that so much of our culture, so much of our life together um, is being lived off those emotions, being driven by those emotions. And, you know, the story of 2020 is the story that we're on edge.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just think there's a lot here to talk about. There's probably more that will come out as the week goes forward, but it seems to me that this was 2020 in a nutshell. 2020 in a stock story was
Yeah.
this GameStop story, and so it was worth at least spending a little time on.
Well, folks, we'll have more investing advice for you after this quick break. I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective after this. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. John, we've been covering the appointments and opening actions of the new Biden administration over the last couple of weeks. And one of the actions that caught, or rather appointments that caught my attention this week was President Biden's choice for education secretary, which Christian Headlines reports on this. Miguel Cardona told senators Wednesday that he believes biological boys who identify as girls have the legal right to compete on girls' teams. And if confirmed to the Post, he'll ensure that schools follow that interpretation of the law. And he described this as the right of those students to compete in extracurricular activities as their preferred gender. And so we see the further enshrinement and entrenchment of this new view of sexuality in the highest levels of the federal government, and it's going to affect policy in a school near you. This is going to actually affect the lives of students, and most notably female athletes. It's going to change the whole picture for young girls. And so let's talk about this and unpack the implications of it, because on one level it's just disappointing to see, but on another level we have to understand exactly what's going on here, why these claims are being made, and and how we can respond to it.
Yeah. Miguel Cardona, was pushed on this issue during his confirmation
Rand
hearing
Paul, I believe.
by Rand Paul. And he really fudged and said things like, well, we're going to have to work this out. And, but we need to respect all students. And to Senator Paul's credit, he kept pushing and pushing until he finally did say, that we need to have those opportunities. Now, why does this make a difference? I was asked this week on another interview about whether or not the assistant secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services, who is a transgender man, a man identifying as a woman. And I know I got that wrong culturally, but that's how I intentionally do it, for the record. Everybody, just wanted everyone to know that. I'll probably get kicked off Twitter like Focus on the Family for saying that. But I was asked, why is that a big deal? And is this one a big deal, that somebody in this position believes what they do? Well, policy comes from worldview, right? Policy is a reflection of what one deeply believes, and the policy that one is going to really care about versus, say they care about as a way to win a base. Those are two different things. And so that's why a question like this really matters. For the HHS position to have a transgender individual in place, the reason that really matters there is because, HHS has been the center of the conflict with religious liberty for a long time now. It is the department that was most starkly different between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Vastly different priorities, vastly different individuals, vastly different worldviews driving these two things. And the concerns, of course, were around the LGBT issues, conflicting with religious liberty, and now you have a member of the LGBT community. Yeah, that's why it's a big deal. it wouldn't be the same. Like, for example, this past week, Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of Fort Bend, was named and confirmed by the Senate as the Secretary of Transportation, I believe. And CNN and many media outlets announced it as a historic moment. Now, it's actually not historic at all, right? The fact that he's gay, or if a transgender individual had been named as the Secretary of Transportation, that's not really a thing there, because, you know, how to set up interstate systems and govern transportation, and you know what I mean? To call it historic really kind of, I thought, sold short the position, sold short Pete Buttigieg's identity and expertise, if he has some, although that's another question that some people have brought up. I don't know enough about it to say one way or the other, but it wasn't historic. It wasn't anything. It's not anything about his sexuality that he's bringing to that position as the Secretary of Transportation. HHS, it's a completely different story, and it's a really big deal. There's actually something going on there. The education post is the same thing, because one of the first executive orders of President Biden was to basically say that the Bostock decision from the Supreme Court last year, which was very narrowly applied to Title VII employment, has to be applied across the board in education and in other areas. That's not, by the way, what the Supreme Court said. That's what the president is saying, that they have to actually bring all these departments in line with Bostock. That's the Equality Act coming via executive order, if that makes sense, at least on the federal level. Obviously, it can't trickle down to private businesses and so on, but it can have a say over education, right? It can have a say on public schools. And then what does that mean for private schools and colleges and so on? So, yeah, I mean, this is in other words, we've been talking a little bit, Shane, about the Equality Act and what that might mean for institutions and religious freedom and so on. This also, again, comes from department heads, and it also comes from executive orders, and it comes from a mix of all of those things all at the same time. And that's why I think some of the concerns about religious liberty right now are pretty well founded.
Well, first of all, John, I think that Pete Buttigieg's experience is going to or his sexuality is going to be very relevant to solving some of the major problems in our nation's interstate system. So, how dare you suggest otherwise? I mean, this really is a historic moment. If he can fix I-4 between Tampa and Orlando, I will be more than happy to
Hey,
overlook any of
I-25
our
between
political
Denver and the
disagreement.
Springs, I am completely with you. But, that was the question, right? Is he was the mayor of South Bend, which isn't necessarily a metropolis of any sort of way, at any sort of level, that has kind of big transportation
Yeah,
problems to solve.
yeah. Look at this quote, John. This was fascinating to me when Cardona said in response to Senator Paul's question, "I believe that schools should offer the opportunity for students to engage in extracurricular activities, even if they're transgender. I think that's their right." Notice the interesting language game that's taking place here. No one is denying transgender students the right to compete in the sport of their choice any more than someone was denying those who identify as gay from getting married, because marriage was and has always been for history between a man and a woman. That's the definition of it. You can compete in sports as your biological sex. That's how it has always worked. The redefinition here is the idea that you have to change reality in order to accommodate identity. So a transgender student is not allowed to compete in high school athletics or college athletics or what have you, unless they are allowed to compete as the gender of their choice, which creates a whole new set of issues for those who actually are competing legitimately in that sport. And so there's something interesting that I've noticed here, John, is that these new invented rights bring into play a zero sum equation, where when you invent a new right, when you try to redefine reality, someone else always loses their rights. And so in this case, it's female athletes. It's women who are going to have to compete against biological men and endure all of the obvious difficulties that accompany that, whether we're talking about locker rooms or performance on the field. And when you consider the fact that so many people are being asked to shut up and accept this, it does it does make you realize that, this can't work. This is contrary to reality. This is obviously a lie. And the more people who point that out, the better. But we're in a real difficult spot here culturally, because these movements have ceased to be movements that convince people every
Mhm.
step of the way. So the early steps in the LGBT revolution, people were actually slowly and gradually convinced or won over on a cultural level. You actually won hearts and minds on that level to say that, you know what, who am I to stand in the way of a gay person getting married? There was actually a campaign there. With the T, by the time we got to the end of the acronym, or the what used to be the end of the acronym, we don't see persuasion happening anymore. We see just this domino effect where the template for arguing for this stuff is already in place.
Yeah.
So we just throw the next thing in, and before you even know it, everyone's agreeing with it. I don't think many of the politicians who have so quickly acquiesced to this, or the companies, or even the voters, are persuaded that a man can become a woman at the drop of a hat. I don't think they're actually persuaded of that. I think that there's a habit that's been created, and a political narrative that's been put in place, to where now we just have to move to the next step. We have to take the logical implication of what we've already bought. And that's what we're seeing. It's like a cascade effect. That's very interesting to me, in light of the policy that's coming down from all these department heads. This is an orthodoxy invented yesterday. This is a grand experiment that's being held at the highest levels of government right now. And it's being done on the basis not of some argument from science that we have, discovered something new about people. It's being done on the basis of morality and rights. And you cannot stand in the way of these kids who want to compete against the opposite sex biologically. Well, who, when did we decide that? Where did that come from? Do we even have a debate about it?
We didn't have a debate about it, and that's really the challenge. And in many cases, we're talking about athletes who would not be able to succeed against their biological gender. In other words, was particularly
Yeah.
boys who would not be able to adequately compete, and are now champions in another category. Um, yeah, these things do matter, and it is coming from every different direction. I think one of the things that has to happen, Shane, just as an action point here, is that our Congress men and women, our senators, need to hear from Christians. I don't think that that many of these folks have made up their mind on things like the Equality Act. Well, Shane, one of the things I'm hearing from some folks on the ground in DC is that there's still an awful lot of communication that needs to happen to our elected officials. And that's something that Christians can do. And our friends at ADF, our friends at, the various, state policy groups, they have, created ways that you can know who your representatives are and actually contact them. But I am hearing that those who are advocating for the Equality Act really have the full court press on, and they're letting folks know. And of course, as we said, it's the Equality Act, it's department policies, it's dear colleague letters, it's, executive orders. There's all of these things that are going to make these concerns very much front and center. And people, we forgot just how front and center they were, in the last years of the Obama administration. And it's kind of game on. Only the culture has moved even more to support this sort of ideas. The Equality Act wasn't an option at the end of the Obama administration. It's very much an option now, culturally speaking, including with, plenty of the GOP who, traditionally would have been against something like this. So I would say, look, this is something that most Christians need to take seriously. Call your elected officials, write to your elected officials, communicate why the Equality Act is not is going to create far more problems than it solves. And it's not a question of discrimination or stopping discrimination. It's about doing what's wise for everyone. And this is going to, create an awful lot of problems.
John, when I mentioned how this sort of template of claims has been hijacked or reemployed again and again by each new successive iteration of the movement, the core claim that's being made there is one of justice, specifically social justice. That's why we refer to social justice warriors, those who are making this moral claim that, men can become women and women can become men because it's right not to discriminate against people who feel that way about themselves. And that takes up ultimately the template of earlier justice movements and sort of links them all together, even things that Christians would consider very much legitimate, like the civil rights movement. And so it really forces us to ask the question: what do we mean by justice, social justice? Is this something that Christians can embrace in some degree, wholly, not at all? It's a very much a live question, and there's an aversion to this idea of social justice in many traditional Christian circles. And on that, that's a pity in many ways, because Christianity has a rich history of reflection on this issue. And there's a new book out that in many ways helps disentangle a lot of this stuff. And we're actually doing a short course with the author of that book. Tell us about it.
Yeah, the book is called "Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth." The author is Thaddeus Williams. The book has received just, I think, a lot of praise and also a lot of criticism because of the topic that it has chosen to take up, which is, how do Christians think about justice? The words justice and social justice are often so poorly defined and used, and causes of justice are so linked together when they don't make any sense, connecting, for example, race and sexual behavior,
Mhm.
both as justice issues, and even the phrase reproductive justice, to refer to abortion. I mean, these are just nonsensical phrases. And I get the alarm that Christians have with that. But unfortunately, I've heard some say, well, if your pastor uses the phrase social justice, you should leave the church. I'm like, well, what does he mean by that? I mean, look, the Bible tells us that God loves justice. The Old Testament prophets talk about justice. The New Testament and Jesus talks about fairness and justice and things like that all the time. And we have got to be people who care about it because we love God. And to love God is to love his law, the psalmist says. And to love his law well is to love people. And so we've got to put all these things together. And I have been waiting for a book that walks through that. And I think Thaddeus Williams has done an outstanding job helping us think about justice in biblical categories. The book's fantastic, but our short course, 4 weeks, every Tuesday night, starting on February the 16th, is week number 1. And basically walking through an hour and a half sessions each week, a time of talking about issues of justice and the Bible, justice and worship, justice and the community, justice and tribalism, all the big issues that are confusing us when it comes to what it means to be a Christian and justice. Dr. Williams does a great job with all that. So, and by the way, we're actually this time, because this is such an important topic, we're offering the very first week of this 4-week course for free, but we got a limited space. So you still got to sign up, and you can come to breakpoint.org/Williams. And we'll link to that if you come to the Colson Center's website, come to breakpoint.org, or go to breakpoint.org/Williams, and you can register for the whole course, or you can register for that first night, which we're offering for free to anybody who signs up.
And this is very much one of those books where you almost wonder if the author had some sort of prophetic ability to look ahead into the future and just sort of anticipate the hot topics of the coming months. Because we in the past year, John, besides COVID and the election, the other big story was this police brutality issue, whether policing is an inherently racist thing with the death of George Floyd and so forth. And then we in the beginning of this year, we're seeing some really sharp divides beginning to emerge in conservative Christian denominations, specifically the Southern Baptist Convention. And this book in many ways speaks to so many of the questions that Christians of goodwill, I think, have when approaching this issue. What exactly can we accept? What can we not accept? How do we do justice and love mercy and yet not compromise, as the subtitle alludes to, truth in the process? And so what a great opportunity to reflect on that.
Yeah, there's some words, I get it, that they become so culturally baggaged or whatever that it's just not any good anymore. I know people,
Mhm.
we have that conversation all the time about the word evangelical. Like, what does the word evangelical mean?
Nobody's sure.
Or, the word tolerance or the word gay. I mean, these are words that have been hijacked and redefined.
Yeah.
I mean, the issue of the word gay is over, right? I mean, this
Mhm.
is not even a conversation anymore for, I would say for worse, but, there you go. And I think people are doing that same thing with the idea of justice. And I'm just like, well, that's not a word. That's a
Mhm.
word that God uses. That's a word that refers to something that God loves. Does it need to be reformed,
Yeah.
recaptured, redefined? Absolutely. Are we ready to give up on it? I don't think that's Christianity historically. And especially if you look at some of the great figures in history, our friend Glenn Sunshine, for example, has done this wonderful series about how Christians have changed the world. And what he means is little corners of the world by acting justly.
Mm.
His rule is to not talk about pastors and missionaries unless what they did had nothing to do with being a pastor or a missionary. And it's a remarkable series, and we recognize kind of their courage and discipleship when we see it, because it's there. And so anyway, I hope this can be a point of clarification. I would say, look, if you're having a conversation about this with your kids, especially high schoolers, which you should be, this is the course you want to take together. He's going to bring up all the right questions and hit it from all the right biblical angles.
Well, John, I was thinking back on books I've read, music I've listened to, shows I've watched, movies I've watched, trying to figure out what I'm going to recommend this week. And one stuck out to me that I don't think I've ever recommended and that I really need to. I'm going to explain it to you real quickly and why I recommend it. Um, I've recommended N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, before. I want to recommend another book of his, How God Became King. The big idea of this book is that the creeds and our gospel presentations as Christians go right from the birth of Christ to his death and resurrection. But we kind of skip over this big middle portion that makes up the majority of the gospel text, and that is his life, of course. And so N.T. Wright, familiar figure in New Testament biblical theology. He's kind of a lightning rod, firebrand. He likes to state things as strongly as possible, and he kind of loves the limelight. But he's brilliant, and he's really helpful, and he's really fun to read. So in this book, How God Became King, he acknowledges that the title is kind of strange. What do you mean? How did God become king? He's been king all along. What he's alluding to is the fact that in Jesus, God himself takes up the throne of Israel, and through that, the throne of creation, and becomes the king of humanity. And he unpacks this in some really helpful ways. The first is with this metaphor of four speakers, where God designed these four gospel speakers, which don't necessarily correspond to each of the four gospels, um, to give us the full symphony of what Christ came to do. He says we've got some of these speakers turned up too loud in the church and some of them turned down too quiet. So the first is the idea that Christ fulfills Israel. He says we've got this turned way down low, so we're barely even connected with the history of the Old Testament there in the church, and he tries to correct that. The second one is this idea that Christ is Yahweh himself come to visit his people. He says we've got this so high in our efforts to do apologetics and to prove that Jesus was God, that it's actually become distorted, and our concerns become concerns that are a little different from those of the original authors of the New Testament. We're more concerned with proving he was God than we are with proving what it means that Israel's God has become flesh. The third one is that the Gospels are the story of God's renewed people, his agenda on earth. And he thinks we've got this one too loud as well. We think the church is this new, unprecedented institution rather than the organic extension of God's people throughout history. So we need to, again, remove the distortions from this, turn it down to a correct level. The last speaker, he says, we've completely unplugged and forgotten about. It's not even making a sound. And that's the clash between God's kingdom and the kingdom of this world that we see in the Gospels. And so Wright says we jump to one of two extremes. We either view the kingdom of God as identified with our world in a sort of social gospel way, so there's no distinction at all, or we view it as irrelevant to this world, where it's just it's off somewhere else. It's a heavenly platitude, and it has no real impact on our actual lives. And this creates two groups of Christians. He calls them kingdom Christians and cross Christians. The kingdom Christians are the social gospel ones who want to, help the poor and remove injustice and fight racism and things like that, but they forget about the message of salvation. The cross Christians are the ones across town who are so preoccupied with getting people to heaven that they're of little earthly good. And he consistently acknowledges, as an evangelical, that these are not two equal poles. He doesn't think they're equal errors. He does think that the people preaching the gospel are closer to the truth, but they're still missing the implications of it. So it's just a really powerful book, very well written, beautiful. It's not new. It's been around for a few years, but I encountered it not too long ago and really enjoyed it. I will say, by way of warning, and I would give this warning to everyone who reads N.T. Wright, he overstates his case badly when he's criticizing someone. So he whether it's his marketing team or just his his sort of, it's Anglicanism, it's the fault of the Anglicans, John. It's his sort of inherent personality, but he overstates the degree to which these truths he's teaching have been forgotten throughout church history, and he sort of creates a caricature in order to then come in and correct it. And the same thing happens in some of his other works. But regardless of that, if you can overlook that and give him some charity on that, I think his points are brilliant and wonderfully stated. And it's just an excellent book that'll change the way you think about the Gospels and Jesus.
I've always thought of N.T. Wright doing that as a teaching mechanism. It's not unusual, right? Jonathan Edwards did some of that.
Right. Yeah.
C.S. Lewis did some
You're
of
a
that.
spider out suspended over the fires of hell with a thread, that.
Yeah, but I mean, it can come across poorly, if you don't, if you recognize yourself in the caricature, then it can hurt a little bit and smart a little bit. But I actually hope that's the point, is when you show the extremes of these things, then we can kind of say, oh, well, look, maybe this speaker is not all the way up to me, but maybe I need to turn this other one up just a little bit, which is the real benefit of that book. It's just seeing how just dramatically, holistically, the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Christ changes everything,
Well,
which is a really good time. It's a really good time to think about that.
It really does relate to what we say at the Colson Center about worldview, is that, Jesus didn't just come to get us a ticket to heaven. He actually came to be the perfect man and then to lead his people in the process of becoming restored human beings and living good lives. And that's why, a number of the church fathers talked about this. That's why he didn't just come as an adult and die. He lived a whole life. And there's a very good reason for that, and a good reason that we have so much data in the Gospels about the last 3 years of his life. And of course, in Luke and Matthew, some of the data about the early part as well. That stuff matters. And, we should care about it, regardless of how important it is to have summaries like the creeds that just get the basic essential bones down.
Yeah. Well, my recommendation this week is GameStop stock. I'm just kidding. It is not. That was too easy. It was a big softball out there. No, actually, I want to recommend. We're recommending so many things right now. We've got Thaddeus Williams' book. We've got Thaddeus Williams' short course. We're really excited about both of those things.
We have a Thaddeus Williams bobblehead too, if you're interested.
We need to create one. There's actually your interview with him will be on the Breakpoint podcast on Monday. So that's just another way to kind of, get in touch with that. What I want to recommend, so I hesitate to just kind of do something else that's kind of self-serving or whatever, but we are doing Wilberforce Weekend in person this year, God willing. And now we say that now, things could change, but that's the plan in Fort Worth, Texas. And it's been good to see some of the news this week of the overall infection rate dropping so precipitously in so many different parts of the world, especially in the United States. So in Fort Worth, Texas, May 20th through the 22nd, it's going to be a terrific lineup, and it's going to be a time just to be together. That's one of the things I missed so much last year when we weren't able to have it in person, although the Truth Love Together virtual event was so great and was seen by so many more people than we could have reached in a live venue. It's just really amazing. Still available, by the way, and we'll link to it at breakpoint.org. But there's just something about the Wilberforce weekend is for so many. It was like a family reunion, especially for the Colson fellows who have spent the last year studying with us. Of course, last year, those who went through the program didn't have their kind of public commissioning, which takes place on Sunday at the Wilberforce weekend.
Which is so cool. It always feels a little bit like that last scene in the first Star Wars movie where they're getting their awards after they destroyed the Death Star, and
You
Chewbacca's
just
like,
ruined that whole
"Grr."
Sunday morning.
Yes.
That's so nerdy. Yeah,
Sorry.
but no, it's but honestly, just to hear from these folks, we've started to do a lot more listening to, okay, what's the 3-year plan that you're going to do, and what are you going to jump into, and it's just really inspiring. And so I'm just thinking that this year is just going to be absolutely remarkable. Our confirmed speakers so far include Carl Trueman, who's written what many people think is the most important book of 2020. And we also have Alyssa Childers, who has joined us in recent weeks on the podcast. We also have Rebecca McLaughlin as an apologist, somebody I've just come across. I'm really excited about the work she's doing. And then some of my favorite people, the Benham brothers, David and Jason Benham, some of the coolest guys you'll ever meet. They are entrepreneurs. They are street preachers. They're pro-life activists. One of them got arrested during COVID for praying outside of an abortion clinic, socially distanced with 6 others. And the police chief, I think, ended up apologizing to him. It's just these guys, and they did it all with a smile from the beginning to the end. There's just something about these guys that I really like. We had them as part of our prayer time back in the fall. And in the middle of a prayer, one of them, I can never tell them apart because they look exactly alike. I don't remember which one was that was actually praying at this point, but he called me devilishly handsome in the middle of the prayer, which really broke things up. But that's the sort of guys they are. They're just really a lot of fun. Looking forward to having them join us. Jennifer Marshall Patterson is going to be joining us as well. And we have more to come. The theme is around the image of God restored. What does it look like for us in Christ to be a restored image bearers? And what does it look like for us to give that good gift to the world? Every cultural issue we face is a failure of the imagination over what it means to be human. And the good news is Christianity's got the best answer on the market by far. Nobody else even comes close. Secular answer to what it means to be human, the Buddhist answer, the postmodern answer, the critical theory answer, the Marxist answer, the feminist answer. None of these things are nearly as good as this beautiful truth that humans are made in the image and likeness of God and fully made human in Christ. And so that's the theme. It's going to be a lot of fun. You can come to breakpoint.org and link on or click on the link here for this program. We'll link you to the Wilberforce Weekend sign up. Don't miss it. Join us in Fort Worth, Texas, this coming May.
And John, because it's in Texas instead of the DC area, we're going to have like barbecue and brisket and potato wedges and stuff like that for the meals, right?
So full admission, I was just in Fort Worth, Texas recently and had what's called bacon burnt ends. So, burnt ends when it comes to brisket, which is, they had bacon burnt ends, and it changed my life. I'll never be the same. I'll never be the same. It probably shortened my life. Those things were unreal. It was like candy bacon. It was unbelievable, but I still haven't recovered.
Yeah, I'll have to get some when I get out to Texas for the Wilberforce weekend. Folks, thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. Be sure to visit breakpoint.org, like John said, where you're going to find links to all of the stories and conferences and short courses that we've mentioned today on the program, as well as just a constantly updated wealth of resources that can help you live and think like a Christian in today's culture. For John Stonestreet and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.